Some say that building systems which encourage and enable players to create unique and personal narratives of their game experiences is the key to creating depth and meaning via game mechanics. So join me, Ryan Wienko, as we look at this a little closer from the perspective of a man who programs AI by trade and designs systems out of necessity. The author is Borut Pfeifer. The article is titled, "You've Got Some Narrative in My System. Hold on, I'll get a paper towel." And of course this is Industry Broadcast. We'd like to start today's article off by thanking Mr. Pfeifer for taking the time and energy to write today's article, and remind everybody that his blog can be found at www.plushapocalypse.com. About a month ago, Steve Gaynor posted a nice consideration of story making, the ways in which players create or embellish their own stories of playing a game. To me, as an AI gameplay programmer, what I get paid to do, and a system designer, what I often need to do, it's interesting to me to think about how to build systems that encourage the player to narrativize their experience, to view their play as an exciting story that they've just had, at least in part, some hand in creating. This is one key path to creating depth and meaning via game mechanics. This behavior naturally has a spectrum, from the player turning to a friend and describing their experience in a stream of conscious expression that is punctuated by descriptions of explosions and character death, to the player attributing and creating more narrative aspects that are represented in the game itself. Say, if you've ever been a creatively repressed teenager with too much time on your hands playing a party-based RPG, or anyone that could get past going to the bathroom, or many of the other more mundane aspects of The Sims. How could we create systems that encourage the player to do more of this, formulating their own stories about their play, without the resulting mess of narrative and mechanics overwhelming? Character and character creation. It should probably go without saying that stories involve characters, but I remember once a friend of mine, a game designer, turned to me and said that he longed for the day that a game like Tetris could make somebody cry. I think he was joking, but just in case, though, stories involve people, or anthropomorphized stuff like toasters. This is what makes us cry, that well and skinning a knee. The biggest step towards this goal is the player's ability to create characters in their story, and the tools they have to do it. The frame that character creation provides is also the introduction that the player has to much ability that they will be able to tell their story with. It helps to craft these mechanics around the narrative context, to point them in this direction. An example is the perks in the Fallout series. They take a systemic effect about a character trait that you can select and wrap into a concept related to the story, like the Daddy's Boy or Girl perk from Fallout 3, which gives you a bonus in your father's skills of science and medicine. More interesting still are the merits and flaws of White Wolf tabletop storyteller system. You're mechanically encouraged to choose flaws, which add penalties to your character through various game systems, but also provide additional experience, which you can then use to buy merits, which are the mechanical bonuses in similar wrappings. The difference is cosmetic in a sense, but by couching it in this way, you're encouraging players to build up a role for their character, using these descriptive terms as a shorthand for the character's background. Character growth. There's two aspects to character growth. The first is how your own created character is changing because of your choices. It's pretty daunting to throw too much character creation on the player up front. One way to manage that is to use the same ideas, but apply them later on as well, to what the player can earn or change about their character as they play the game. The second is to show other non-player characters, those presented to the player as part of the game's story, and how they change their relationships with the player characters. Ideally, these characters are not without change, as how else would you define characters? There is no reason you couldn't go to the same depth with player character traits as you would with the NPC traits. Sure, they might use the same stats systems, but the player's choices and interactions could allow for adjustment in those stats with appropriate relation to the story. Some party-based RPGs have certainly done this, like relationship modulated through persistent dialogue choices, a la BioWare games, love interests, and such. There are a host of existing paradigms that can be applied to character relationships, like mapping relationship states to gameplay states, and tracking relationship status changes as achievements, bonuses, or penalties. It's amusing to me that we don't actually see more of this. Earned personalization. I'll admit, for a long time, I have abhorred any character customization that had no mechanical impact, like your character's fashion choices. So easy to give it even the slightest consequences from your choice, like Fable's clothing and tattoos. But the power that such customization affords the player for investing in their own story is not to be overlooked or undervalued just because of that bias. On the surface, having many objects in a system that have no mechanical differences, only aesthetic ones, would seem to be non-systemic story-making elements. Systems do have to be built to support the additions of such, but the system side becomes more interesting when the act of personalization is treated as a reward or as a systemic role itself. In Fable 2, you can give any character a nickname that takes precedence over the name given to them by the game's creators. Literally tacked on, these names don't give much power to the player. Were they earned, they would provide a natural inflection point in the player narrative, marking the player advancing in the relationship with the character. The assigning of the nickname would then be a story point in on itself. After all, even George W. Bush assigned nicknames because of shared experiences on the basis of building rapport with the characters in his somewhat disastrous presidential sim game. Emotionally representative systems. These are systems whose mechanics are set up to induce an emotional representative state of the narrative context. Consider the spatial movements of passage, or even the move versus shoot controls of Resident Evil 5. The dynamics created by these mechanics are meant to convey the feeling of the passage of a lifetime of experience, or the constrictions of choice that fear places upon you in life or death situations, respectively. These, of course, are elements of the story world the game developer provides, but they provide an emotional framing for the player. Without imposing specific plot constraints, they create the feel of memento mori, or the horror game. They give the player narrative footing to move around, while the emotional tone they provide is something the player can build and improvise upon. Symbolism and metaphor in system mechanics. The best immediate example I can think of here is from God of War. Kratos' climactic battle to save his family from the many versions of himself. He can sacrifice his own health and transfer it to his family to save them, leaving a wake of death in his path up to that point. This is the one positive act that Kratos can perform in the game. These mechanics are not emotionally representative because going up and hitting a button doesn't make you feel like you're hugging your family to save their lives. But it's a metaphor for the destruction Kratos has brought upon his own family, and his coming to grips with it by sacrificing himself for them. The problem with applying this example to story making is there's not much the actual player has to choose in the system. If you want to keep going, you have to complete the fight, and depending on your skill level, you'll have to sacrifice some of your health for them regardless. Now, if these mechanics were presented to the player as a choice, the player could drive their narratives one of two ways: the way God of War goes, or to an even darker place, where Kratos refuses to deal with the harm that he's brought to his family. But that's only possible by using these mechanics combined with that context to create the metaphors for the change in his character. Event-driven systems. It is important to look not just at the mechanics of a given system, but what events those mechanics imply. A high density of events that have an emotional context ties into the natural memory formation that comes from experiencing emotionally impactful events. By managing this, making sure that the system includes events that have an inherent emotional perspective, like success or loss, it is easy to remember and create stories about those events during play. The melee combat system of a beat-em-up provides a simple palette of events to start: a successful hit on an NPC, or the player, or the knockdown or death, or either. If you add in grappling, that gives you the dramatic event of struggling with an enemy, being pinned down when they temporarily win the grapple, and defeating an enemy via a grapple. If you throw ally characters into that system, you have even more events. The injury or loss of an ally might become an important element of the player's story. It's even better if you can support these events by tying them into a larger narrative. Take the buddies of Far Cry 2. Playing the game, if you accept missions from your buddy, or if you die and your buddy saves you, you advance your relationship, potentially unlocking more missions. Tying these inflection points of the system, like death in combat, back into the narrative gives the player more control over both their moment-to-moment story and the larger plot direction. Systemic pacing. What Left 4 Dead achieved with its AI director is nothing new. Yeesh, that was in 2003. It does, however, mark the highest profile and probably most polished success of such a work. Systemic pacing really can't be looked at as a solution in and of itself to this problem, but it can be a key layer on top of all of these and other elements. The thing to watch out for is the hope that it will somehow solve other problems with lower-level systems, and somehow tie them together narratively for the player. It won't. It can take them to the next level, though, integrating them in more varied ways to increase the story-making possibility space, even if it's as simple as modulating when, how many, and of which kind of enemies spawn. Layering systems and training storytelling. With all of these types of systems, the amount of choice can be overwhelming. For example, Christian Majewski at Game Design Scrapbook describes Play First's user testing of Emerald City Confidential via Emily Short, which found that casual gamers freeze when presented with just even multiple choice dialogue, being accustomed to one correct choice and lacking feedback as to the consequences of their choice. Besides using what I'll call the optometrist gambit, only ever presenting two choices as clearly different as possible, the old is A better or is B, this is kind of a thorny problem. Choice is what drives both character and plot. If players are paralyzed by fear of choosing incorrectly, neither can really progress. We have varied tools at our disposal, from slowly introducing systems to throttling the changes in complexity to creating audio, visual, and mechanical languages for the players to understand the consequences of their narrative choices, to varying the impact of any individual choice, potentially requiring many choices to add up to anything drastic. But whatever the strategy is, you had better have one. And this is me, Ryan Wienko, signing off for yet another insightful article from IndustryBroadcast.com. If you want to check out more of Borut Pfeifer's writings, we recommend that you head over to www.plushapocalypse.com. And if you want more of the collective insight of the gaming industry, well then head over to IndustryBroadcast.com.